Welcome. We're back. I'm starting to feel some empathy with Kevin. I might have been on your screens enough times, but this is the last segment of the morning, and we still have some presentations to look forward to ahead of us. So let's go there. This session is on the climate benefits of mass timber and wood products. And I'm going to introduce first the director of the Forest Carbon and Forest Carbon and Climate Program for Michigan State University Forestry Department, Lauren Cooper, and then Lauren in turn will introduce her colleagues. So Lauren, you're welcome to turn on your camera when you wish. So there you are. So hi.
Hi.
As many folks in this world, we've only met in these virtual worlds. Do a quick introduction. Lauren is experienced in forest carbon project development, policy analysis, and wood utilization linkages to sustainability. Her current research looks at socio-ecological carbon cycling, conservation incentives, and linking development and conservation, with an emphasis on state-level decision-making, particularly with the U.S. Climate Alliance. Her expertise is in policy implementation, impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, knowledge transfer, and forestry. She's currently leading a forest carbon modeling project across the U.S. I'm sorry, across 5 U.S. Across a different technology that I hadn't silenced. The landline went off. She's currently leading a forest carbon modeling project across 5 U.S. states to inform forest planning and management with climate benefits. And with that, Lauren, I will turn it over to you with thanks. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much. I am really delighted to be here, so thank you so much for the time today. We were really excited to have the opportunity to speak with the group and be part of this really important meeting. Again, I lead the Forest Carbon and Climate Program, and I'm here with 2 of my very close colleagues, Daphna Gadoth and Kylie Clay. Daphna is we're going to kind of trade off our presentation today. So Daphna is our program coordinator. She has a Master's of Forestry from the Forestry Department, and we have been really lucky to nab her and bring her into our program. So she's been leading coordination and has been increasingly getting involved in research and in supporting the development of training materials. And then we have Dr. Kylie Clay, who will be giving the second part of the presentation today. She recently graduated from University of Washington with an emphasis in political economy. She has done her research in forest use and illegal activities, and has been really transitioning a lot of the social science thinking into the carbon and climate space. So
Lauren,
we are.
Excuse me for interrupting. Could you bring your slides to full screen? That way we won't peek ahead. That way we won't peek ahead. So yeah.
Yes. How's that? Okay. Now this gets a little tricky. For some reason it pauses this when I see if I can move ahead. See, it pauses the screen. Hold on, it just takes me 1 second to do this. Does this?
Yep, got it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, and so we're going to move through a range of kind of topics. We're going to cover the background, the foundational ideas behind forests and climate change, and what's the relation there. Why are we talking about forests in terms of climate change? Review for many of us, but a great foundation to start the conversation. Then we'll hand it over to Kylie. She'll discuss the climate benefits of mass timber and construction, and then I'll take it back over and talk about a little more detail on the forestry side, so the sustainable forest management and its relationship to products, touching on certification. We'll highlight a couple of examples, and then we'll close with a couple of slides on how to engage with the FCCP if you're interested in more information on these topics. And so with that, I will pass the mic to Daphna, and I will turn off my camera while she gives her presentation. Oh, Daphna, we can't hear you. Hmm.
Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. I don't think I had the power to unmute myself there. Apologies for the delay. So thank you all for joining us. Today I'm going to discuss the role of forests and their relationship with climate change. So first I'm going to do a brief refresher of the greenhouse effect, which underpins the challenge that we face of global climate change. This is a natural process in which greenhouse gases in our atmosphere absorb and re-emit radiation that's reflected off the Earth's surface. This essentially traps heat in the Earth's surface and in the lower atmosphere, and this makes our Earth habitable by maintaining global temperatures relatively warm. But this is a delicate balance, and recent human activity has actually altered this balance and increased the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, in turn intensifying the temperatures that we experience on our planet. There are many different types of greenhouse gases, but we will largely focus on carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas whose concentration is heavily influenced by human activity, and it also persists in our atmosphere for hundreds of years. It's also 76% of all greenhouse gas emissions from human activity are carbon dioxide. And we actually measure the impact of other greenhouse gas emissions in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents, which is a metric that we use to normalize and compare these greenhouse gases. In this next figure, we'll look at the recent trends in carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere and temperature and how they correlate with one another. The flat line you can see across the middle represents the average global temperatures and carbon dioxide concentrations over the time frame you can see on the x-axis. And you can clearly see this very strong connection between the trends in increasing carbon dioxide in our atmosphere and increasing global temperatures. So as emissions from human activities continue to increase, we continue to experience these increased temperatures on our Earth's surface. So in this next slide, we'll look at different carbon fluxes from different carbon pools on our Earth's surface and how they impact the carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere. So as new carbon dioxide enters our atmosphere every year from these carbon sources, such as fossil fuels and land use change, they are also mirrored by different carbon sinks, in which the carbon dioxide resides, because the carbon dioxide has to go somewhere. So it's very important to note that land can serve as both a carbon source and a carbon sink. It often serves as a source when we experience massive land use change, such as mass deforestation, but it can also be a sink, whereas natural processes such as photosynthesis absorb that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in living and dead biomass in different natural ecosystems. So it's important to note that the land use sector is very significant because it can influence carbon fluxes as either a source or a sink, depending on how we deal with the land. In this next figure, we kind of take a closer look at these different carbon sources and sinks. And in a natural landscape, if you look at the left side of this graphic, you can see that natural landscapes are both absorbing and releasing carbon dioxide in natural forms of photosynthesis and respiration, but they absorb more than they emit. Whereas human activities are just emitting, not absorbing, carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And specifically, the building and construction sector is responsible for 39% of all carbon dioxide emissions. 28% are attributed to building operations, such as heating, cooling, and general maintenance. And another 11% are attributed to emissions from construction and the manufacture of materials like steel and concrete. It's also important to note that the ocean has been a major carbon sink and absorbed a significant amount of our atmospheric carbon dioxide to date. In this next figure, we look at the tree level processes and how carbon moves through a forested ecosystem and interacts with trees and the environment in which they live. So carbon dioxide is absorbed during photosynthesis and makes up about 50% of a tree's dry weight. Carbon is also stored in forest ecosystems in the form of dead living biomass or dead tree and plant tissues, such as wood and leaf litter. And it's also in the soil, which holds a huge storage of carbon in the ecosystem. Through processes of respiration and decomposition, carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere, but it's important to note that healthy forests absorb more carbon than they release, which allows them to store carbon over time. On this next slide we'll look at even more detail of these different carbon pools. And you can see that the carbon resides in both living and dead biomass. In living biomass, this includes trees, shrubs, ferns, and grasses that are living and growing. And in dead biomass, this includes dead roots, down woody debris, and leaf litter that have not yet decomposed fully. In the soil, carbon is in the form of humus and microbial biomass. And like I said before, the soil is a very important storage of carbon. On this next slide, we'll look at a couple forest-based strategies for mitigating climate change. Humans have a lot of influence over the management of land in different forests, so we can actually have a very big impact here. For this session, we'll focus on number 3, the increase in wood use and substituting wood for energy-intensive building materials. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Kylie to explore some of these benefits.
All right. Thank you, Daphna. As Daphna said, I'll now talk a little bit about harvested wood products, including mass timber, and how they can contribute to these efforts, that is, keeping more carbon on the ground and not in the atmosphere. So, go to the next slide. Yeah. So there are 2 things we know about the construction sector. One, as Daphna noted, it constitutes a large share of total global emissions. So as the figure on the left shows, embodied carbon, which is the direct and indirect emissions associated with building, manufacturing, and construction, is responsible for 11% of total global emissions. So that's just the emissions associated with putting the buildings up, has nothing to do with the extra emissions associated with keeping them running. So the second thing we know, as we see on the right side, is that building is projected to increase. So as we see on the figure on the right, it's showing that more than a doubling of service sector buildings alone by mid-century. Other model projections show similar figures, similar growth rates. We're looking at essentially a doubling of global floor area by 2050, 2060. And that comes to adding a new New York City to the globe every month for the next 40 years. So quite a bit of growth there. So the heavy emissions associated with the construction sector are on one hand a scary thing, but on the other hand a good thing, because they mean that through changing construction practices and especially through changing materials that we use, the construction sector has the power really to make a serious dent in global emissions. So how does wood play a role in that? A couple of ways. So first, trees actually store an incredible amount of carbon. When you take down that tree, not all of that carbon is emitted into the atmosphere. So as the chart on the right shows, the right-hand side we'll focus on, as the trees are harvested here in around year 37, that carbon leaves the tree, but a sizable amount of that is retained in short-lived harvested wood products and long-lived harvested wood products. There's a lot more going on in this figure here, but then we have time to discuss. So for that, we'll just leave it at that for this moment, that within the harvested wood products, we're storing a chunk of that carbon. And we'll get to the product substitution in just a minute. So we'll go to the next slide, Lauren. Yeah, thanks. So harvested wood products are storing a chunk of this carbon, but there are limitations to how much it can actually store. So 50% of a tree is carbon, but we're generally not that efficient in our production of harvested wood products. So as this figure is showing, each stage of wood processing is losing some bit of carbon. Part of that's from the actual wood loss, and we can improve that with greater wood use efficiency. But another chunk of that loss is coming from the reality that we use fossil fuels to produce these harvested wood products, all of them, right? Lumber, paper, etc. And so when we think about carbon being stored in harvested wood products, we have to deduct all embodied emissions associated with processing and manufacture of those those wood products. So harvested wood products store carbon, that's great, but that can't be the end of the story. We'll go to the next slide, where wood products really shine is in their substitution for other materials. So LCAs are life cycle analysis, what we use to measure the embodied emissions throughout the entire life of a product. And pretty overwhelmingly, LCAs reveal that lumber, wood panels, other forest products used in construction store more carbon, emit less GHGs, and use less fossil fuel energy than steel, concrete, brick, vinyl, whose manufacture is seriously emissions intensive. So we'll go to the next slide just to look at how this plays out. So though timber production is generally not carbon neutral, it's better than the alternative. And that's really where wood products shine. So if we look at the top figure, as we can see, the wood house is associated with net positive emissions, right? So the best case scenario for the environment would be to not build that house at all. But in reality, the house is going to be built. So every time we put that up a wood house in place of a steel or concrete house, we are saving those emissions. So if we look at the units in the figure, as an example here, a wood house uses 350 units of energy, say emissions, to be constructed compared to 550 from a steel house. So in building that wood house, we are storing an additional 200 units of emissions, keeping that out of the atmosphere and keeping that on the ground. Okay, so the bottom figure shows a similar story. It's a more recent comparative LCA looking at cross-laminated timber compared to so it's an 8-story structure, cross-laminated timber compared to more conventional concrete. And we see a similar story, right? There is an environmental impact of construction of the CLT building, but it is significantly lesser than that of the traditional concrete building. The degree to which wood is superior to concrete and steel on these environmental measures is debatable, and it really depends on, it's hard to have a rule of thumb, let's say. So it really depends on all the different stages of the process. So as I noted here at the bottom, there's looking across 70 plus comparative LCAs in the literature, there's an average reduction of approximately 2.4 to 3.9 tons of CO2 equivalents per ton of dry wood used. Lauren later will talk a little bit more about what that looks like as examples of specific buildings. But so that's the average, but the range is dramatic, and it's really going to depend on the specific details of the construction. So if we go to the next slide. Thank you. So as I said, the range is quite large. On average, and 90% of the comparative LCAs have wood faring better than alternatives, steel and concrete. So we can generally say that wood is a positive in this sense, but by how much is really going to depend on the details. So both the details in reality in terms of how much carbon we're storing, and then the LCAs are going to depend on the assumptions about those details. So details about forest management, lumber processing, construction from that side, and then also details about the assumptions we're making about this hypothetical other project that didn't occur. That is, the assumptions we're making about the energy efficiency of the concrete or steel structure that was not constructed, right? Because it's all comparing to this hypothetical. So just as an example of this, if we look at the figure on the right here, compares just floor beams. So it's not merely a question of are we looking at wood or are we looking at steel. Here we see a sizable difference in the emissions saved coming from an engineered wood product I-joist compared to a wood beam. So they're both preferable. These are both showing emissions saved relative to a conventional steel beam, but the engineered wood product is showing sizable, a greater number of emissions saved relative the traditional wood beam, right? So it's not just wood or steel, it's not just, and then the details get far more nuanced than that. And it should be noted that, so LCAs are not perfected and standardized, and that's somewhere that the research is probably going, especially if we're thinking about having building tax credits, that sort of thing, based on LCAs. We'll really need to push the LCA research to be as I say, a little bit more standardized, and so that it can be verified and trusted. Okay, go the next slide there. Okay, so then other benefits come from continuing to bolster demand for working forests. So what we're not talking about, when we say that harvested wood products can store wood and they're a good thing, but in the alternative, we're not talking about let's take down the Amazon and turn it into tables and chairs or houses, right? Nobody's talking about that. And Lauren will touch more on the importance of having insurances in place so that that's not what's happening. What we do want to happen is that we make it economically attractive to keep working forests as forests. And that is to say, land use decisions are driven by economics. And if a landowner has a working forest that is no longer economically viable, the likelihood that will be converted into development or converted into agriculture is high, right? So we want to make sure that we're continuing to have a growing demand for timber products. Given what we've seen about the growing construction industry, it's doubtful that that's, I would say, I think it's unlikely that we're really going to lose too much of that. So more so, we're thinking about the second point here, which is making restocking and reforesting more attractive to landowners, to make them really want to invest in the forests that they do have, to keep them not just forests, but keep them growing forests that are sequestering more and more carbon. Okay, thank you, Lauren. Next slide. Okay, and then for CLT specifically, so what I've been speaking about so far is more on harvested wood products in general, of which mass timber is one. But when we're looking at CLT specifically, there are even more advantages that we have. And you may recall the figure that was looking at a CLT beam compared to a wood beam. The CLT has more storage potential, carbon storage potential than even wood in some cases. And that is in part because of factory-based manufacturing. So everything constructed in the factory leads to less material waste, so greater wood use efficiency. And then additionally, you have less desirable wood, such as low-grade logs, byproducts of logging, and also urban tree removals can be used in mass timber construction. And so both of these things mean that we have more carbon being stored in longer-term wood products, which is a plus. And so there are some trade-offs that I note here, and that is, this is just one example, right, which is that it's maybe too simplistic to say, let's throw all the wood into harvested wood products that we can, because, so this example below is looking at salvaged wood post a fire, for instance. There is evidence to suggest that going in and salvaging wood post a fire, post burn, can actually have negative effects on the regeneration of the forest in the aftermath of that fire. So the farthest leftmost figure there shows regeneration following a burn naturally compared to following a burn if there's been wood salvage. So the actual wood staying on the ground in this case, the point of that is if wood stays on the ground, it's actually better for the forest and reforestation in general. So we don't want to have a too simplistic view of this to say that let's take the wood and we have it. We have to really think about the ecosystem as a whole and how that tree, what role that tree is playing there. So it's just in general notes, let's not be simplistic about it, but we need to be thorough and thoughtful in all of this decision making. And the next slide, Lauren. Thank you. And the last note, this is not a benefit of mass timber necessarily, but likely reality that the future is probably going to have more stringent emission standards for construction. And a couple of examples here, certain cities are pledging that future construction will operate with net zero emissions by 2030, some by 2050. Others requiring operational carbon, so that's not in the embodied carbon, not in the construction, but limits to emissions that will be allowed from operational carbon. There's certainly a trend toward more environmental standards, and I think it'd actually be surprising if we didn't have stricter regulation on that going forward. So with that in mind, it seems, it would behoove us all to start thinking about this early as opposed to having it forced upon us, right? So for the construction sector, there can be a lot of gain in efficiency to start moving in this direction sooner rather than later. And with that, I will pass it to Lauren to talk about how we really want to think about certification and sustainability in all this.
Thank you very much, Kylie. Really nice overview there. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through some of the kind of forest considerations, and I'll start by bringing us back to this slide to kind of ground us again. So again, these are these three primary forest-based strategies for mitigating climate change. We kind of unpacked one aspect of increasing wood use, which could be in mass timber. Long use construction is one of the best ways to store that carbon over a long time. But I'm going to explore a little bit more here on the increasing or maintaining forest land, but also increasing and maintaining carbon stocks is kind of the underpinning of this last section. And I'm going to start by bringing in this concept of climate smart forestry. And many of you may have been starting to hear these types of phrases. There's climate smart ag and climate smart forestry. This has really taken off in Europe. So for our European colleagues, if they're on the call today, this is probably pretty familiar. But it's really like a theoretical lens to think of forestry. And I kind of like to unpack it, particularly for people that are part of forestry and forest industry, to kind of start to break apart maybe some barriers to thinking about forest in terms of carbon and climate. And so this is really a pretty broad concept. It can be implied and interpreted in lots of ways on different landscapes and by different professionals, but it's really a targeted approach to increase climate benefits from forests. It does respect and embrace other needs related to forests, so it's not suggesting that we put carbon or climate as the number one deciding factor for how we manage forests. And it has these three pillars, so reducing and or removing greenhouse gas emissions, adapting forests to build resilient forests, and then active forest management to sustainably increase productivity and boost those benefits for human uses. And so we posed the question, does forest certification kind of equal climate smart forestry? Like, where are these new ideas versus where are these concepts that we already have in operation? And sometimes it's just an issue of terminology or slightly adjusting the way that we're understanding some of our activities. And so we really found that there are a lot of direct linkages. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about forest certification and how it's linked with this background, this theory of this climate smart forestry. And so for those that are not very familiar with certification, so if you're involved in building and construction and you're not really familiar with what certification is, I think it can be helpful to clarify a couple of important terms in the core definition here. So forest certification is a mechanism for forest management, monitoring, tracing, and labeling of timber, wood, and pulp products and non-timber forest products. And this is where the quality of forest management is judged against a series of agreed upon standards. And so over here we have the standard, which is actually like the protocol or the guidebook you would use to meet the certification. Certification itself is confirmation that you've met the requirements of a particular standard. It does require third-party verification. And then accreditation is the mechanism to ensure that the organizations that undertake the certifications are competent and can produce the credible results. And I like to introduce this idea here as well, that we're talking specifically about working forests, so that could be a more intensely managed or more like selection cutting or selective cutting. But across the landscape and a landscape view, there's a wide range of values, and this relates to carbon and climate as well. So you could have your older growth that's at very low risk for natural disturbances and are high value for recreation and high value for water quality provisioning and certain habitat, and you might manage this forest less and you would value this for your high carbon pools. And you might have other areas that could be maybe more prone to high risk for fire, for example, and this could be where you could target higher productivity and higher value for harvested wood products. And so I think this is really an emerging way to think across a landscape, but it's just an example of how carbon and climate can add an extra lens of decision making, but doesn't guide completely the decision making for forests. So a little more detail here for certification. These are specific examples from SFI. My next slide, I'll show you the main standards. But these are generally what you'll see in certification. So the management of the forest itself, the fiber sourcing of where material is coming from and going to the mill, chain of custody, which tracks the material over time, and then some fundamental core principles. And again, this is exactly how SFI happens to break these up. But they're based on principles of sustainable forest management, and it really facilitates this climate smart forestry and best management practices, which I'll touch on here. For those that aren't familiar, BMPs, which have their origination in the Clean Water Act, are a set of guidelines that are to protect water quality, really. But there's a lot of practices that have become very important in forestry and forest management. And so some of the initial focus was more on limiting disturbances to soil and, again, preserving the water quality. But it's really quite a robust standard or set of guidelines now. They have 11 categories, but the trick is they're not regulatory or required in every state. So some states they're not required, some is quasi-regulatory, and some have very strict requirements. And so what you can see with certification is certification will require that at the minimum actors are meeting BMPs, and this is the goal of that is to raise more actors on the landscape up to these higher levels of compliance with these best practices. And again, just a wide range of topics that it covers. So any fuel spills, minimizing ruts, considering biodiversity and wildlife habitat. And you can see a lot of mirroring in the certification standards themselves that have a lot of components of the BMPs. Just want to share this briefly to, I'm sure some of these logos are familiar, but some of the big actors are SFI, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, Forest Stewardship Council, American Tree Farm. Depending on where you are in the world, you'll have different dominant certification bodies. Just put these up here as a kind of reminder of who some of these big actors are, particularly in the United States. And some landowners, including the state of Michigan, is dually certified by SFI and FSC. So just a little more on the forest management, how to become certified. The forest owner must follow the set guidance, complete inventorying, implementing the BMPs, and then again, auditing by third-party verifiers. Loggers are required to complete specific trainings, and again, meeting up with the BMPs for that state. And it's important to note that many of these best practices have implications for carbon storage. So anytime you're reducing any degradation or minimizing mortality of remaining trees, for example, you're going to have carbon benefits. So this is an area of, I think, future work is to really start to unpack and maybe quantify what the carbon benefits are. Just a little bit more on fiber sourcing and chain of custody. Again, chain of custody tracks the entire path. So it really tracks it picks up right where the forest certification ends. So it goes from mill all the way to your certified product. That's your chain of custody. Fiber sourcing is actually referring to not certified, but legal and responsible sources of material that's going to the mill. And this is an important standard for typically smaller family forest owners that maybe don't have can't undertake the costs of full certification. So just to kind of clarify the two here. And one of the big important takeaways is that mitigation and adaptation, so linking back to our carbon and climate, harvested wood can be a profound part of the climate solution, but it's only if it's sustainable. So if it's resulting in forest loss or forest degradation, you're going to erode your climate benefits very quickly. And so we do have mechanisms to ensure sustainability. Certification is one. We also have regulations that limit land use change or incentives to encourage certain types of behaviors. So there are checks and balances in place, particularly in places like North America, to ensure that we don't have negative impacts from wood use. And again, we actually could see even positive impacts with increased investment in some areas that really will require additional management or interventions to keep those forests healthy going into the future. So with the changing climate, we may very well need additional interventions or putting in preferred species or taking out not preferred species going into the future. And, you know, healthy forests today may be at risk by 2050. And so just to quickly cover our examples, we have the MSU STEM building and Brock Commons of University of British Columbia. know we've talked about this quite a bit, so I won't go into any details, but just the carbon storage benefits, it's estimated to have over 1,800 metric tons of CO2 stored in the structures, and then additional climate benefits, which can use some further analysis as data becomes available, but the avoided manufacturing emissions of steel and concrete. And then again, that potential for greater performance over time in terms of energy use can provide continuing climate benefits in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions from fuel use. But example number 2 is Brock Commons. It's a very large 18-story structure that was built at University of British Columbia. It meets the LEED Gold certification standard. This wood structure was completed in less than 70 days after the prefab material arrived. So that's approximately 4 months faster than a building of this size. And so there's going to be clearly some emissions reductions there just from the speed of being able to work with the material. It's estimated to store almost 1,800 metric tons of carbon dioxide, and they were able to calculate this, avoided almost 680 metric tons of CO2 from the efficiencies. And I have just the last couple slides here on the FCCP in case there's some interest in connecting with us. We have a professional short course that launched in 2019. We've had about 150 participants in over 13 countries, called Understanding Forest Carbon Management. And this is just a very interdisciplinary topic. And so we approach the course design like that, and be happy to share more information with anybody that's interested. But particularly to this group, we have what we call mini course. So you can see it's only 3 modules. And this has a deeper dive into these connections between forest certification and climate change, which can be important for people that are more on the procurement or wood utilization side to understand in more depth these connections between certification and climate. And then possibly also of interest is we have an open resource library. It's like completely free materials on our website. We have a learning module that's about 20 minutes that you'd be welcome to link to. It's at the USDA Climate Change Resource Center. This is a nice introduction. We have unique graphics and slides that we've created. You're welcome to download and put them in any of your communication materials. And we also have a series of videos that can be used to learn more about the measurements and the carbon inventorying side of things. And then finally, we have a monthly webinar, and we're just about to launch. This is a preliminary draft. We're announcing it, I think, tomorrow, of a monthly webinar. And we have previous recordings from last 2 years on our website. But if you're interested in this topic and you'd like to possibly hop on, we'd love to have you. And so feel free to shoot us an email. We could get you on our email list as well, or just come check out on our website. And that's all that we have for today. Thank you so much for the time.
Well, thank you all, and you're welcome to turn your cameras on. We have time for about one question if you would like. We've received a number from the audience, and I'm doing some quick editing here. There was one that I just had to ask, because it was if the tree falls in the forest question. When a tree decomposes on the ground, how much of the carbon continues to be stored in the ground, and how much is released into the air? And you started to address that in research opportunities, I think.
Yeah, I feel like we could all answer this in some degree. It largely depends on the ecosystem type. So where carbon ends up being stored in different pools depends on how quickly that carbon can decompose and be broken down. So you'll find in the tropics, there's not a lot of carbon in the soil. There doesn't really tend to be as much carbon in dead material because it breaks down so quickly and it goes back to the atmosphere. In cooler climates, you'll have much slower decomposition. And so in some of those areas, you'll have very rich soil carbon and also rich pools of dead or decaying material as well. And I don't know if Daphna wanted to chime in with anything else.
That's about right.
Okay.
So another question.
So location dependent.
Go ahead.
I was just saying it's a location dependent. It can actually vary quite a bit by your geography.
Sure. A question from a Timothy Rodriguez. you talk about the construction industry, I mean, you, I presume y'all, steel, concrete shell at 11% carbon or 11% of carbon. As we migrate to mass timber construction, what percent of carbon is related to the construction? I think, by which I think it means what percent is related to the material, because we also need to consider carbon for cutting, hauling, installation. The train didn't stop by the woodlot. I mean, there are so many carbon questions related. Just talk a little bit about that interrelationship of carbon in the whole supply chain process.
So I can touch on that a little bit, which is so absolutely correct, right? The construction of CLT will also be associated with emissions, so it's not going to be a net zero. And it's hard to say what percentage of that will. So if we switched all construction to mass timber as opposed to concrete and steel, it's hard to say how much emissions we would actually save, because it's true, transportation of these materials, there are so many fossil fuels that are used in the production of mass timber, so it's hard to say, and it's really dependent on, to say, the assumptions we make about fuel efficiencies, fossil fuel efficiency, right? So if we are existing in a world where we're using more renewable resources in place of fossil fuels for the production of mass timber, then we're going to be significantly better off than the alternative. If we are living in a world where the transportation distances from factory to construction are much reduced, it will also be significantly fewer emissions than the alternative. So it's really hard to have a number to say, okay, how much can we actually cut? Because it really depends on the whole process. So one of the figures that I showed that compared the construction of a CLT 8-story building to a concrete, it shows about 75% reduction, and that includes, that is attempting to include all of those factors, right? It's not just the materials, it is the transportation, the processing, all those factors. So including all those in that particular assessment, it's looking at 75% of, so a 25% reduction in emissions, but really it's such a wide range depending on the assumptions you make.
It depends. Yes.
It depends. Sorry.
It's
not a fun answer.
I hear you, and it's okay.
But can I add one little thing to that quickly, Brian, too? Is that I think that going forward, it can be an issue of finding where is the potential that we know we will have climate wins. How can we ensure that we're using these materials in the best way? So that could be ensuring sustainability, of course, in how the forests are managed, but it could also be, developing more regional production, so that the materials that are being produced in the region are being focused in the Great Lakes area or something, so to reduce some of the transportation emissions. So as we continue to have more data, then there becomes opportunities to make more specific recommendations of how we can increase those climate benefits.
Cool. And I'm going to make that the last question for now, in honor of the time. And we've had some questions that have to do with linkages to data and so on. And what I'll mention to you, though we had not talked about this previously, what I'll mention to you is other presenters, even just this morning, as we've been communicating, have stated that they will post their presentations on MIFP's website, or allow us to post them on the website so attendees can see them. I'll also say that attendees will have the entire recorded presentation at their disposal. But if you want to jump to a presentation, a posting may be there. So if you all would like to do that with any of the data linkages or material you presented, have a conversation with Julie Manley, and she can post that on the website.
Sounds good. Thank you again for having us.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here. There's some really interesting things going on there, so thank you. So with that, yeah, we'll wrap up. Bye. Yeah, this has been a lot of material, and a lot of depth and a lot of breadth. And we sincerely hope that this has been of value to you. As I know it's been of value to me, when I've been able to listen and what are these folks really saying about the amazing work that's going on by folks in our state and beyond. So a few things, and then we're done. Next time, the 29th, there will be 3 sessions again. Session 1 will be on cost-benefit analysis. Session 2 will be on building codes. And then we will also have a lunch and learn, and the topic will be on finishing mass timber. On October 6th, the program will begin to wrap up with a lengthy multi-part session on design, construction, and logistics, hearing from national and local leaders on that topic, and then wrapping up with a conversation about opportunities and barriers. And we'd love that opportunities and barriers conversation to also be about next steps, because we don't see this as the end of a conversation. We see it as hopefully a beginning and a catalyst for conversation among all of you and all of us. So I have one apology to make to our friends at the Chrisman Company, constructors, who through the error of a person who's actually talking right now, neglected to add their logo to the slides that were shown, acknowledging our sponsors, and we very much want to acknowledge them as a sponsor, as an exhibitor. So thank you very much to the Chrisman Company, as well as, of course, to all of our other sponsors. Presentations, as I said, will be posted as allowed by the presenters to the NIFB website, and in addition, you will have access to the recording of the entire sessions. So thank you again. We really appreciate you being here, and my clock says it's a couple minutes before noon, but I don't think you will reject the use of that minute or two of time. So this is my one only turn as host, so I appreciate you hanging out with me and us today. My other colleagues will be hosting the next 2 sessions, and I look forward to joining you more on the audience side for those as well. So have a great day, enjoy, be safe, be well, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.